Hey guys, Hamsterwheel here, back with another video, and welcome to my Burning Crusade caster guide. So you feel like joining a private server, or you already joined one, and you're all about that caster DPS, but you have no idea how viable each class is. Well, fear not, because in this video I will be talking about all the different classes you can roll and show you their pros and cons, so you can make a well-informed decision on what class you want to pick to raid with. The Burning Crusade knows 5 caster DPS classes, which are Mages, Warlocks, Priests, Balanced Druids, and Elemental Shamans. Each of these have their own unique playstyle, abilities, and they all bring something different to the table. Let's start off with one of the original caster classes, the Mage. Some people call them vending machines, but they aren't exactly slouches when it comes to the DPS. The great thing about Mages is that pretty much every single spec is viable in PvE. Full Arcane? Works. Full Fire? Works. Arcane Fire? Works. Arcane Frost? Works. Hell, even Full Frost works just fine, and to me that's one of the strong points of Mages. While other classes are stuck with one spec and one rotation, Mages can go wild with their different specs that all work just fine. So if you get bored of Fire, for instance, you can go and respec to one of the many other specs that are available. Their classic task of handing out Arcane Intellect, polymorphing to help with crowd control, and providing drinks and food to the group are still much appreciated in both early dungeons and endgame content. Not to mention their ability to give 5% extra crit when you're full frost, or 15% fire damage when you're rolling as a fire mage. Mages do have their problems though. They've always had a hard time keeping up with them warlocks, and unlike them, they don't have an infinite mana pool. Mages do have their gem and evocation to keep them going for a long time, but at some fights, Keltas for instance, they do tend to have some mana issues, so they have to break out the wallet and buy some mana potions to keep them going. So in short, their pros are great DPS, the many viable specs, CC abilities, great AoE damage, and the buffs to the group such as intellect and drinks and food. The cons are the mana related issues, and since they're cloth they can be quite squishy. Alright, time to talk about the second DPS caster class that has been with us since WoW Vanilla. The Warlock. Ah yes, in Burning Crusade, Warlocks were once again given the Mages a good run for their money. With the introduction of the 41 talent tree, you now have some crazy specs to choose from, including Affliction, which is considered to be the best for lower geared Warlocks, Demonology, and the famous Shadowbolt spam spec. I've been raiding on Phoenix for a long time now, and it seems that the last spec is the preferred spec for Warlocks, simply because it stacks really well with gear, making them able to dish out 9k Shadowbolts with the right gear and raid consumables. And like I said when I was talking about Mages, they have an infinite mana pool because of life tap, meaning they can do DPS for as long as they please. Some healers might not like it that much, but it is undeniably a strong point of the Warlock class. Oh, and by the way, did I mention Seed of Corruption? Quite possibly the strongest AoE ability in the entire game, being able to pull over 10k DPS if the tank can hold aggro and if the packs of mobs are big enough. They also bring some pretty handy buffs to the group, including a Curse, which increases damage on the target, a Soul Stone, which grants a self-rest to whoever gets it, a Soul Well, which provides the whole raid group with health stones, and they can even use their Imp to provide an extra stamina buff when needed. Warlocks aren't perfect though. Unlike Mages, they don't have Ice Block or Mana Shield to grant them a bit more survivability, so they are squishy, and even though the Shadowbolt spam spec is the preferred choice, it is a rather boring spec to roll with. So to wrap things up for the Warlocks, we have great DPS, infinite mana pool, buffs to the group, and best AoE damage in the entire game. The cons are the rather boring rotation of some specs, and the fact that they are even more squishy than Mages. Let's talk about a caster class that is quite new to the DPS game compared to the other two, the Priest. Usually considered to be the go-to healer class in Vanilla, Priests were finally given the chance to shine in the Burning Crusade with the revamped talent tree that allowed them to finally compete with Warlocks and the like on the DPS meters. The strong point of Shadow Priests is really the buffs they bring to the raid. First of all, they can increase the shadow damage done to the target by 10% because of their Shadow Weaving talent. And on top of that, the target gets an extra 5% spell damage taken by their Misery talent. So if you're a Warlock and you rely on shadow damage, that's an extra 15% damage increase for you. So yeah, the Shadow Priest was a Warlock's best friend. Not only that, with their Vampiric Touch and Vampiric Embrace, they were able to replenish health and mana, making them able to take a little bit of stress off the healers, which is always appreciated. I also really like the rotation of Shadow Priest. Unlike some spec from the Mage and the Warlock, the Shadow Priest rotation really requires you to be on your A game. There's a lot of dots you need to keep track of and refresh, while in the meantime throwing out Mind Blast, Mind Flay, and Shadow Word Death as much as you can. With their reduced melee damage taken in Shadow form and the ability to shield themselves, Shadow Priests are also less squishy than the other two Clothy casters. Then there's the other choice of DPS, a very unpopular one that I had the pleasure of exploring in the Burning Crusade, the Smite Priest. Often laughed at, the Smite Priest is actually viable here in the Burning Crusade, but only for very short fights. They can be great buff bots with their power infusion, improved shields, and with a bunch of talents scattered across the Discipline Holy Tree, they could off-heal in an emergency situation. Most priests roll with Shadow, however, since it is the better spec of the two, and I can't blame them. Just like the other two classes, Shadow Priests have some problems. They are usually lacking behind Mages and Warlocks in the terms of DPS, and even with the addition of Vampiric Embrace and Shadow Fiend, they are prone to go out of mana much quicker than Mages or Warlocks. So in a nutshell, fun rotation, great support class, but the downside is obviously the mana issues and the suboptimal DPS. Time to talk about another caster class that is new to the game, the Moonkin. Back in vanilla they were not really that viable. You either needed a crap ton of gear or your guild was okay with having a wannabe mage that didn't do nearly as much DPS and went out of mana a lot quicker. No, in vanilla you had to go resto. Then the Burning Crusade hit with the revamped talent trees and all of a sudden Boomkins were dealing out heavy crits, forever changing their name from Moonkin to Boomkin. That's right, in Burning Crusade balanced druids were finally viable for raiding and they are now a great addition to any raid group. First of all, they give the entire group an extra 5% spell crit chance with their Moonkin aura, and their ability to hand out innervates to healers who were going out of mana was much appreciated. Not that the healers got them all the time though, cause the mana issues were still lurking around the corner and still affecting the Moonkin class, hence why tier 4 for instance focused on being able to keep on casting with their tier 2 set bonus and the amount of spirit that was on the set. It does get better though once you're rocking tier 5 gear and up. Another thing that was an issue with Moonkins is that with lower gear, it was hard to sustain good DPS. Moonkins were always lacking behind the superior DPS of Elemental Shamans or Mages in lower dungeons, and it's only when they get full heroic gear and start raiding that they can finally catch up with the other classes again. So how is their DPS in actual raids? Well, they're around the middle. Not bad at all, but certainly not up there with an equal geared Warlock unfortunately. The fact that in Moonkin form you have a lot of armor and the fact that you have bark skin does make you a lot less squishy than those caster classes who are stuck with wearing nothing but cloth. So in short, they have good DPS, provide crit and innervates, are less squishy than Warlocks or Mages, but they have mana issues and they are struggling with DPS in lower gear. And then we arrive at the last caster class that is also fairly new to the caster DPS group, the Elemental Shaman. Elemental Shamans have always had a soft spot in my heart. Ever since I saw I wrecking people left and right in one of his PvP videos, I always envied Shamans and their incredible burst damage. They were never really welcome to raids in vanilla though. They went out of mana too fast and didn't bring as much to the table compared to a resto Shaman, just like the Druid and the Priest. Nowadays in Burning Crusade private servers, they are pretty much essential to any raid group, since they are without a doubt the best support class for casters. They have so many abilities to boost not only their own damage, but their party's damage as well. First of all, they have the Totem of Wrath, which gives the party 3 extra spell crit and 3 extra spell hit. Then there's Wrath of Air Totem, a totem that gives the party an additional 101 spell damage. Then we have Mana Spring for extra MP5, Stone Skin for reduced damage, Tremor Totem for charm and fear effects, and the list goes on and on. But probably the most awesome ability Shamans have is Bloodlust, which increases the attack speed, that's right, both melee and ranged, for 30% for 40 seconds, which is a huge DPS boost for any class. So being able to give other people a lot of buffs is great, but what about yourself? Well, for starters, the elemental spec works great with lower gear. I can't tell you how many times I touched 1k DPS with my Shaman while doing dungeons when I was still wearing blues with a bunch of greens. Chain Lightning is an absolutely devastating spell in dungeon runs where you're often fighting packs of mobs, making it very easy to do high DPS without breaking a sweat. On single targets, Elemental Shamans do kinda dip down, but should have no problem sustaining high DPS with a little bit of help from the odd trinket or two. So far so good, eh? Well, just like all the other classes, elemental shamans aren't perfect. For starters, they don't have any crowd control, which in some dungeons, Shattered Halls for instance, could be a problem. They also have two main offensive spells, Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning. During long fights, you're probably gonna do nothing else but spam Lightning Bolt and refresh totems. And that's it. So yeah, the rotation is rather boring. So, in a nutshell, they do great DPS, the spec works really well even with crappy gear. They're the best support class, but they lack CC and they have a boring rotation. And there you go guys, that's all the DPS caster classes in the Burning Crusade. I hope I was able to give you guys a brief overview of the different classes that you can choose from, and the pros and the cons that each class has. If you have any questions, make sure you post them down below and I'll do my best to answer them. As always, I want to thank you for watching this video. I'm Hamsterwheel and have a good one.